My name is Felicia and I'm 32 years old. Right now, I'm standing in my corner office overlooking Manhattan as my assistant announces my father's arrival. He's here begging for a bailout for his failing construction company. The same man who told me at 18 I'd never amount to anything who gave my college fund to my sister saying boys are better at business anyway. Now, he doesn't know I'm the CEO of the investment firm he desperately needs. I watch him fidget in the lobby below, completely unaware his rejected daughter controls his fate. Before we dive into this incredible journey of betrayal and triumph, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Are you someone who's ever felt overlooked or underestimated by your own family? If this resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of underdogs who rose above their circumstances. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their current rejection might just be redirecting them towards something greater. Now let me take you back to where it all began, to a little girl who just wanted her father's approval, but got something much more powerful instead. Growing up in our household meant understanding one fundamental truth: Madison was the sun and I was merely a distant planet in her orbit. My father, Frank, made this crystal clear from the moment we could walk and talk. While Madison attended the prestigious Whitfield Academy with its manicured lawns and Olympic-sized pool, I took the city bus to Jefferson Public High, where textbooks were held together with duct tape and hope. But education inequality was just the beginning of a pattern that would define my entire childhood. I remember being 12 years old when report cards came home one December evening. I had straight A's across the board, even managing a perfect score in advanced mathematics, despite our school's limited resources. My hands trembled with excitement as I waited for my father to come home from his construction company, imagining how proud he would finally be of me. Madison, then 14, had managed mostly B's with a single A in art class. When Dad walked through the door, I practically flew to him with my report card held high like a trophy. He glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds before setting it on the counter without a word. Then Madison showed him hers, and suddenly, our dining room transformed into a celebration venue. Dad actually called his business partners to brag about Madison's A in art, claiming she had inherited his creative vision for architectural design. That night at dinner, he went on and on about how Madison would revolutionize the construction industry with her artistic eye. When Mom quietly mentioned my perfect grades, he waved his hand dismissively and said, "Academic achievements don't translate to real-world success." The business trip started when Madison turned 15. Every summer, Dad would take her to visit construction sites across the country, introducing her to suppliers, contractors, and potential clients as his protégé and future successor. I begged to go just once, promising I would be quiet and take notes, but he always had the same answer. These trips were for serious business minds, he said, and I should focus on skills more suitable for my future, like cooking and keeping house for the successful husband I would hopefully find one day. Mom would pat my shoulder sympathetically, but never contradicted him, her silence as painful as his words. By the time I reached 16, I had learned to stop seeking validation from my father, but the universe apparently decided I needed one more definitive lesson. The state mathematics competition was the most prestigious academic event for high school students, and after months of preparation, I had won first place against hundreds of competitors from schools that had resources we could only dream about. The local newspaper even wanted to do a feature story on the girl from the underfunded public school who had beaten all odds. I rushed home with the trophy and the newspaper reporter's business card, certain that this achievement was too significant to ignore. That same afternoon, Madison came home with her report card showing a C+ in geometry, her highest math grade in 2 years. Dad's response was to immediately call our extended family to share the wonderful news that Madison was finally grasping mathematical concepts, proving she was ready to handle the financial aspects of running his business. He ordered pizza and cake to celebrate her breakthrough, while my trophy sat unnoticed on the kitchen counter. When the reporter called that evening to schedule the interview, Dad told them I was unavailable and hung up. His message was clear: my achievements would never matter in his eyes. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. If my father refused to invest in my future, I would build it myself. I started an online tutoring business using the family computer after everyone went to bed, teaching mathematics to students across the country who needed help. My rates were lower than established services, but my results were exceptional. Word spread quickly in online forums, and soon I was booked solid every evening and weekend. I opened a bank account at a different bank than my family used and watched with pride as my college fund grew dollar by dollar, knowing that each tutoring session brought me closer to independence. For 18 months, I maintained this exhausting schedule while keeping my grades perfect and my business secret. By the week of my 18th birthday, I had saved $8,000 through nothing but determination and sleep deprivation. It wasn't enough for a full college education, but combined with scholarships, it would give me a chance at a real future. I had even started researching which universities had the best programs for business and finance, printing out information at the school library since I couldn't risk using our home computer for college searches. Everything unraveled on a Thursday evening when I made the fatal mistake of leaving my bank statement in my backpack instead of my locked drawer. Madison, looking for money to borrow, went through my things and discovered everything. Within minutes, she was showing the statement to our father, expressing shock and concern that I had been hiding such a large sum of money from the family. Dad's face went through several shades of red as he processed the information, and then he did something that broke whatever remained of our relationship. He drove me to the bank the next morning and made me withdraw every penny. Standing in that bank lobby, he lectured me about trust and family loyalty while pocketing my $8,000. That money, he declared, would go toward Madison's new car since she needed reliable transportation for her future role in the family business. As for my college dreams, he made his position crystal clear. Women didn't need business skills or higher education, just the ability to support their husbands and raise children. If I was smart, he said I would stop wasting time on foolish ambitions and start focusing on becoming the kind of woman a successful man would want to marry. That night, as Madison drove around in her new car bought with my dreams, I sat in my room and felt something fundamental shift inside me. The hurt transformed into something harder, stronger, more focused than mere anger. I looked at my empty bank account statement and made a promise to myself that one day I would be so successful, so powerful, that my father would have no choice but to see what he had thrown away. Little did I know that this moment of absolute betrayal would become the foundation of an empire that would one day hold his fate in its hands. The acceptance letters arrived on the same April morning, changing the trajectory of two lives in very different ways. I had barely slept the night before, refreshing my email every few minutes, until MIT's admission decision finally appeared. My hands shook as I read the words offering me a place in their business analytics program with a partial scholarship covering 60% of tuition. Even with the scholarship, I would need family support for the remaining costs, but surely this achievement would finally prove my worth. Madison received her acceptance to State University the same day, a party school known more for its social scene than academic rigor. Exactly what she had hoped for to continue what she called networking for her future business career. At breakfast, I could barely contain my excitement as I placed the MIT letter next to my father's coffee cup. He read it slowly while I held my breath, waiting for the pride that had to come. Instead, he set the letter down and turned to Madison with a huge smile, congratulating her on getting into State University. Then he announced the financial arrangements he had already decided without consulting anyone. Madison would receive full tuition, room and board, plus a generous monthly allowance for expenses. As for me, he suggested I look into community college, or perhaps consider that marriage option more seriously since MIT was clearly beyond our means. I felt my mother shift uncomfortably beside me as I struggled to process his words. The construction business had been particularly profitable that year, with 3 major contracts completed under budget. There was money available, just not for me. When I pointed out my scholarship and academic achievements, he launched into a lecture about realistic expectations. Madison would be taking over the family business, so investing in her education made sense. I, on the other hand, was chasing fantasies that would only lead to disappointment. He actually used the phrase that a woman with too much education becomes unmarriageable, as if we were living in the 19th century instead of the modern world. That evening, while my father and Madison celebrated her college acceptance at an expensive steakhouse, my mother slipped into my room with an envelope. Inside was $2,000 in cash bills of various denominations that she had been hiding in different places over the years. She held my face in her hands and whispered that she was sorry she couldn't do more, that she had failed me as a mother. I wanted to be angry at her weakness, but seeing the defeat in her eyes, I could only hug her and promise that I would make it work somehow. That money became the seed of my survival, carefully rationed to last as long as possible. MIT was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. While my classmates complained about tough professors and challenging coursework, I was fighting a war on multiple fronts. I worked 3 jobs to survive, tutoring in the evenings, cleaning offices overnight, and serving coffee on weekend mornings. My schedule was a carefully orchestrated nightmare that left me 4 hours of sleep on good nights. I ate 1 meal a day to save money, lost 20 pounds I couldn't afford to lose, and wore the same 3 outfits in rotation until they literally fell apart. But I maintained my grades through sheer willpower, knowing that losing my scholarship would end everything. Junior year brought an unexpected collision of worlds when Madison decided to visit Boston for a shopping weekend with her sorority sisters. I was working at a coffee shop near campus when they walked in, their laughter filling the space with the careless joy of those who never worried about money. I tried to duck into the back, but Madison spotted me immediately. Her eyes lit up with malicious delight as she loudly called out to me, making sure everyone in the shop could hear her explain to her friends that I was her poor sister who couldn't afford college without working multiple dead-end jobs. The humiliation might have ended there, but fate had other plans. My father had come to Boston for a construction conference and decided to surprise Madison with dinner. They arrived at the coffee shop just as my shift was ending, and what followed was one of the most painful experiences of my life. In front of my co-workers, classmates who were studying there, and complete strangers, my father decided to make an example of me. He spoke loudly about how some people knew their place in life, while others wasted time chasing impossible dreams. He pointed out my worn shoes and exhausted appearance as evidence of what happened when people didn't listen to wisdom. Madison joined in with enthusiasm, sharing fabricated stories about how I had always been jealous of her success and how sad it was that I couldn't accept reality. She actually told people that our father had offered to help me, but I was too proud to accept assistance, completely rewriting history to make herself look charitable. The crowd grew uncomfortable as the verbal assault continued, but I stood there taking it all, my hands steady as I cleaned the espresso machine, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Among the witnesses was Professor Chen, who taught my advanced financial modeling class. He had been sitting in the corner grading papers, and I watched his expression grow darker with each word my father spoke. After my family finally left, Professor Chen approached me quietly and asked if I would consider becoming his research assistant. The position came with a small stipend, but more importantly, with mentorship from one of the most respected minds in financial analytics. He told me later that he had recognized something in that moment, not just intelligence, but the kind of steel forged in furnaces most people never experience. Under Professor Chen's guidance, my final year at MIT transformed from mere survival to actual growth. He pushed me beyond textbook knowledge into real-world applications, introducing me to his network of former students who had gone on to build successful careers. He taught me that the greatest investors weren't those born into privilege, but those who had learned to see opportunity where others saw only obstacles. My thesis on identifying undervalued assets in distressed markets caught the attention of several firms, leading to job offers that my father would never have believed possible. Graduation day arrived with all the pomp and circumstance MIT could muster. I had sent invitations to my family more out of obligation than hope, so their absence didn't surprise me. What I learned later from my mother's tearful phone call was that Madison was having a grand opening for her first business venture that same day, a boutique clothing store funded entirely by our father. He had chosen to attend her ribbon-cutting ceremony instead of my graduation, telling extended family that a store opening was a real achievement while anyone could get a degree these days. Even my mother hadn't been allowed to come, threatened with consequences if she defied him. Standing in my cap and gown, summa cum laude honors cord around my neck, job offer from Preston Investment Group in my pocket, I felt the last threads connecting me to my birth family finally snap. Professor Chen took pictures with me, telling me he was proud to stand in as my family for the day. My classmates celebrated with me, not knowing that I was mourning and being reborn at the same time. That evening, alone in my empty apartment, I opened the folder containing my job offer and signing bonus information. The bonus alone was more than my father had taken from me all those years ago. It was poetic justice, but I wanted more than poetry. I wanted an empire. The next morning, I packed my few belongings and left for New York City to begin my new life. I didn't call home to say goodbye or leave a forwarding address. My family had made their choice clear through years of actions, and now I was making mine. As the train pulled away from Boston, I thought about Madison's boutique and my father's construction company, how they believed those small ventures were the height of business success. They had no idea what was coming, no conception of the hunger they had created in someone they had dismissed as worthless. That hunger would drive me to heights they couldn't imagine, and one day when they needed salvation, they would find it came with a familiar face they had thrown away. Preston Investment Group occupied 3 floors of a Manhattan high-rise, its offices humming with the kind of energy that only comes from people who measure success in millions. My first day wearing my only suit carefully pressed and my shoes polished to hide their wear, I felt like an imposter among the Ivy League graduates who seemed to breathe confidence like air. My desk was in the bullpen with the other junior analysts, but to me, it represented everything I had fought to achieve. Within a week, I established a routine that my colleagues found extreme: first to arrive at 5 in the morning, last to leave at midnight, weekends spent poring over market reports and financial statements that others ignored. The breakthrough came 3 months into my tenure, when I noticed something others had missed in a struggling manufacturing company's financials. Hidden beneath layers of poor management decisions was a patent portfolio worth 10 times the company's market value. I spent 72 hours straight building a comprehensive analysis fueled by coffee and the memory of every dismissive comment my father had ever made about my abilities. When I presented my findings to the senior partners, they initially seemed skeptical that a junior analyst had discovered what their experienced team had overlooked. But the numbers didn't lie, and when Preston acquired the company and sold off the patents, the firm netted $43 million in profit. That success earned me a reputation as someone who could see value where others saw garbage, and the partners began funneling more complex cases my way. I discovered a gift for recognizing patterns in chaos, for understanding not just what a company was, but what it could become with the right guidance. My second major win involved a chain of urgent care clinics hemorrhaging money due to insurance billing inefficiencies. While others recommended closure, I saw an opportunity to revolutionize their billing system and negotiate better rates. The transformation took 6 months of 18-hour days, but the clinics went from near bankruptcy to acquisition targets that sold for 8 times their original value. By my second year, I had generated more profit for the firm than analysts with 5 times my experience. The partners took notice, and Samuel Preston himself began mentoring me personally. He was a legend in the industry, a man who had built his fortune by betting on opportunities others feared to touch. In me, he saw a kindred spirit, someone who understood that the greatest returns came from having the courage to go where others wouldn't. He taught me about leverage, about patience, about building networks that extended far beyond Wall Street into the very industries we invested in. It was during this period of rapid ascension that Madison called me for the first time since college. Her boutique had failed spectacularly, leaving her with $50,000 in debt and no way to pay it. She had already burned through two more ventures funded by our father, each ending worse than the last. Her voice on the phone carried none of the smugness I remembered, replaced by a desperation that might have moved me if I hadn't remembered her laughter in that Boston coffee shop. She needed the money within a week, or she would face legal consequences for bouncing checks to suppliers. I listened to her entire sob story without interrupting, then calmly told her that I couldn't help. The silence that followed was deafening until she exploded into threats. She would tell our father about my selfishness, about how I was abandoning family in their time of need. She actually used the phrase, "blood is thicker than water," seemingly forgetting how thin that blood had been when I needed help for college. I informed her that she was welcome to tell our father whatever she wished, as I had no relationship with him to damage. Then I hung up and went back to analyzing a potential acquisition target, her crisis already forgotten. The call from my father came exactly as expected. 2 hours later, his voice volcanic with rage. According to him, I was an ungrateful daughter who had forgotten everything the family had done for me. The irony of that statement was so rich, I actually laughed, which only fueled his anger further. He ranted about duty and obligation, about how real family members supported each other, conveniently forgetting every time he had refused to support me. When he finally paused for breath, I delivered the words I had been crafting since the day he stole my college savings. I told him he was dead to me, using the exact phrase he would throw at me later, and that I wanted no contact with any family member who had stood by while he destroyed my dreams. The disownment was mutual and final. He declared that until I learned my place and apologized for my selfishness, I was no longer his daughter. I agreed wholeheartedly and ended the call feeling lighter than I had in years. That night, I celebrated my orphanhood with the expensive bottle of wine and a toast to the future I was building without them. Samuel Preston, who had overheard parts of the conversation, took me to dinner the next week and shared his own story of rising above family dysfunction. He saw potential in me that went beyond analysis and deal-making, the makings of a true industry leader. At 26, when Samuel offered to make me the youngest partner in the firm's history, I accepted with one condition: I wanted to create a new division focused on distressed assets in the construction industry. He found the request oddly specific but trusted my instincts. What he didn't know was that I had been studying my father's industry for years, understanding its cycles, its players, its weaknesses. I began quietly acquiring struggling construction companies through a complex network of LLCs that obscured my identity, rebuilding them with better management and selling them for massive profits. Each acquisition taught me more about the industry my father thought I could never understand. I learned about supply chain vulnerabilities, about how weather patterns affected material costs, about the delicate dance between contractors and unions. More importantly, I discovered that my father's company, once a regional powerhouse, was starting to show cracks. His refusal to modernize, combined with Madison's expensive failures that drained capital, had left them vulnerable. I filed this information away, knowing that patience was the greatest weapon in long-term strategy. Within 4 years, my construction portfolio controlled 30% of the regional market through various subsidiaries. Industry veterans whispered about the mysterious force reshaping their landscape, never suspecting that the architect of this transformation was a woman they would have dismissed as irrelevant. I attended industry conferences using assumed names, sitting in the back, taking notes while my father held court at the front bragging about his business acumen. He had no idea that many of his competitors were now ultimately reporting to his disowned daughter. The real satisfaction came from the success stories I created along the way. Companies on the brink of closure were transformed into thriving enterprises. Workers who had feared for their jobs found themselves with better pay and improved conditions. I implemented training programs that turned laborers into skilled craftsmen, created advancement paths that rewarded merit over connections. Every success was a rebuke to my father's philosophy that breeding and gender determined business capability. My mother, who had secretly maintained contact through a friend, would occasionally send updates about the family's growing struggles, each message confirming that my patience would soon be rewarded. By 30, my net worth had crossed 100 million, built on the foundation of every rejection and humiliation I had endured. Madison continued her string of failures, each more expensive than the last, while our father stubbornly refused to acknowledge that his chosen heir was bleeding his company dry. His pride had become a prison, and I held the keys. I had presentations prepared, showing how I could save his company files, documenting Madison's incompetence and embezzlement, evidence of the empire I had built from nothing. But I waited, knowing that true victory required him to come to me to beg for help from the daughter he had thrown away. The construction industry's next downturn would provide that opportunity, and I would be ready. The day Preston Investment Group went public marked a turning point, not just in my career, but in my carefully orchestrated plan. As the youngest female CEO in our sector at 31, I rang the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange with Samuel Preston beside me, the man who had become more of a father to me than my biological one ever was. The financial press couldn't get enough of the story about the woman who had risen from junior analyst to CEO in under a decade, though they didn't know half of the real journey. My shares in the company pushed my net worth past 200 million, a number that would have been incomprehensible to the girl whose father stole her $8,000. Meanwhile, in my hometown, the construction industry was experiencing upheaval that I had both predicted and partially engineered. My various subsidiaries had been strategically underbidding on certain projects, not enough to lose money, but sufficient to squeeze margins across the sector. Companies that had adapted to modern methods survived and thrived under this pressure. Those clinging to outdated practices like my father's firm found themselves struggling to compete. The quarterly reports I received through various channels painted a picture of slow-motion collapse at Franklin Construction, accelerated by one particular factor: Madison. My father had made Madison vice president of operations 2 years earlier, a role she was catastrophically unqualified to handle. Her first major decision was to rebrand the company with an expensive marketing campaign that consumed nearly $1 million while generating zero new business. She insisted on lavish client entertainment expenses, believing that champagne and caviar could substitute for competitive pricing and quality work. 3 major contracts were lost in 6 months due to her inability to manage project timelines and budgets. Experienced foremen quit rather than deal with her incompetence, taking decades of institutional knowledge with them. The financial hemorrhaging might have been survivable if Madison had possessed even a shred of business acumen or ethics. Instead, she treated the company accounts like a personal ATM, justifying every expense as necessary for maintaining the firm's image. The corporate credit cards showed charges at luxury retailers, 5-star restaurants, and exclusive resorts, all categorized as business development. When the CFO questioned these expenses, she had him fired and replaced with someone more pliable, someone she was secretly involved with, romantically. I monitored this situation through various sources, including former employees who had joined my subsidiaries and banking contacts who shared concerning patterns in Franklin Construction's financials. The debt levels were climbing rapidly, while revenue declined, a death spiral that even my father's pride couldn't ignore forever. When their primary lender threatened to call in loans, I quietly acquired that debt through a shell company at 70 cents on the dollar. The bank was happy to offload the risk, never knowing they were handing me the weapon I had been crafting for years. The chess pieces moved into position with beautiful precision. I acquired two of my father's main competitors' companies that had been family businesses for generations, but lacked succession plans. The owners were ready to retire and appreciated my commitment to keeping their employees and maintaining their companies' reputations. With these acquisitions, I controlled 60% of the regional construction market through various entities. I could now influence pricing, control supply chains, and effectively determine which companies would thrive and which would struggle. Creating the perfect storm required delicate timing. I had my subsidiaries gradually stop subcontracting work to Franklin Construction, citing quality concerns that were unfortunately legitimate given their brain drain. Other firms followed suit, not wanting to risk their own reputations. Soon, Franklin Construction found itself boxed out of the lucrative subcontracting network that kept many firms afloat between major projects. My father scrambled to find new partners, but his reputation for late payments and Madison's for impossible demands preceded him everywhere. My mother's late-night calls became more frequent during this period, her voice trembling as she described the stress consuming their household. My father had aged visibly, his famous confidence replaced by desperate bravado that fooled no one. He had mortgaged their home to inject capital into the business, a detail that nearly broke my resolve. I had to remind myself that this was the same man who had told me I was worthless, who had chosen Madison's failures over my successes at every turn. Still, I promised my mother that when the time came, I would ensure she didn't suffer for his choices. The evidence of Madison's embezzlement came to me through an unexpected source, the replacement CFO's ex-wife, who worked for one of my subsidiaries. She provided documents showing a systematic theft of company funds channeled through fake vendor accounts into offshore holdings. Madison and her lover had stolen nearly $3 million over 18 months' money that could have saved the company if properly invested. I had my legal team verify every transaction, building an airtight case that could send both of them to prison for years. When my father discovered the embezzlement, his world finally collapsed entirely. His golden child, the one he had bet everything on, had betrayed him in ways he never imagined I would. But instead of involving law enforcement, he chose to cover it up, too proud to admit his judgment had been so catastrophically wrong. He liquidated his remaining personal assets to partially cover the stolen funds, told investors it was a bookkeeping error, and kept Madison in her position with only a private reprimand. It was exactly the response I had predicted, the final proof that his pride would always be his downfall. The trap was now fully set. Franklin Construction had no credit, no contracts, no reputation, and no hope. Every avenue of escape had been systematically closed, except one: Apex Capital, the mysterious investment firm that had been revolutionizing the construction industry. My father would have to swallow his pride and approach the very type of firm he had always dismissed as vultures feeding on real businesses. He would have to beg for help from strangers, never knowing that the stranger waiting for him was the daughter he had declared dead to him. I prepared for his arrival like a general preparing for battle. Every detail of my office was designed to project power and success, from the panoramic city views to the awards and recognition lining the walls, the presentation materials documenting his company's failures and my various successes were loaded and ready. The security footage from that humiliating day at the coffee shop was queued up on my personal monitor. Most importantly, I had practiced my opening line 1,000 times, the words I had been waiting years to deliver. The only thing left was for him to walk through my door, and recent intelligence suggested that moment was imminent. The construction industry whispers reached a crescendo as Franklin Construction's death spiral accelerated beyond anyone's predictions. My network of informants reported that my father had spent weeks making increasingly desperate pilgrimages to every major lender and investment firm in the region. Each rejection added new lines to his face and removed another degree of his legendary arrogance. The man who once strutted through industry conventions like a peacock now shuffled through lobbies with the hunched shoulders of the defeated, clutching presentations that outlined recovery plans nobody believed possible. Unknown to him, I had anticipated and influenced many of these rejections. Several firms owed me favors or had business relationships with my subsidiaries that made supporting my father inadvisable. Others simply recognized a sinking ship when they saw one. The feedback was consistent. Franklin Construction had waited too long, bled too much, and lost too much credibility to warrant investment. One particularly cruel rejection came from a former protege of my father's who told him bluntly that putting an incompetent daughter in charge had been corporate suicide. Madison's panic manifested in increasingly erratic behavior as the walls closed in around them. Her shopping sprees intensified despite the company's financial crisis, as if designer handbags could somehow fill the void of impending failure. The embezzlement with her CFO lover accelerated from clever theft to reckless pillaging. They were like rats gorging themselves on a sinking ship's supplies, too focused on immediate gratification to notice the water rising around their ankles. My forensic accountants tracked every transaction, building a case that would be prosecutable for years to come. The family home became a battlefield, according to my mother's tearful reports through our intermediary. My father raged at shadows, blamed everyone except himself and Madison for their predicament, and consumed whiskey like water to dull the pain of watching his empire crumble. He had built Franklin Construction from nothing over 30 years, and now it was weeks away from bankruptcy. The man who had once declared that real business was about tangible assets and honest work found himself drowning in the very financial complexities he had dismissed as paper games played by lesser minds. 3 weeks before everything came to a head, I received an unexpected call from Madison directly. Her voice had lost all its former smugness, replaced by a trembling desperation that almost made her sound human. She begged me to help our father, invoking family bonds she had helped sever, making promises of reconciliation that rang hollow as a bell. When emotional manipulation failed, she tried threats, suggesting she knew people who could hurt my business if I didn't comply. I recorded every word, adding it to my collection of evidence, and told her calmly that she had made her choices long ago. The final trigger came when Franklin Construction's last major client pulled out after a project deadline was missed by 2 months. The domino effect was immediate and catastrophic. Subcontractors filed lien, suppliers demanded immediate payment, and the union threatened to blacklist the company if worker wages weren't paid within 72 hours. My father had exactly one option left that didn't involve bankruptcy and complete liquidation approach. Apex Capital, the firm everyone said had deep pockets and a track record of saving distressed construction companies. I knew the exact moment he decided to make the appointment because I had eyes and ears throughout his organization. His assistant, who had suffered under Madison's abuse for years, quietly informed my team that Franklin Construction's CEO would be presenting to Apex Capital's board the following Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. She even shared his presentation materials, a desperate mixture of inflated projections and barely concealed begging that would have been pitiful if it weren't so perfectly poetic. The week before the meeting tested my resolve in unexpected ways. My mother called through our intermediary, sobbing about potentially losing the home where we had grown up. Despite everything, childhood memories flooded back, learning to ride a bike in that driveway, building snow forts in that yard, crying in that bedroom after another rejection. For a moment, I wavered, considered simply buying the house anonymously to preserve those few good memories. But then I remembered that same house was where my college dreams were crushed, where my savings were stolen, where I was told I would never amount to anything. The momentary weakness passed, replaced by cold determination. I spent the evening before the meeting reviewing every piece of evidence, every moment of humiliation, every sacrifice I had made to reach this point. The security footage from the coffee shop played on repeat as I prepared my appearance. I chose my outfit carefully, a custom-tailored suit that cost more than my father had stolen from me. Jewelry subtle but expensive enough to convey wealth without ostentation, shoes that would click authoritatively on marble floors. Every detail was designed to embody the success he said I could never achieve. My assistant was instructed to treat him with professional courtesy, but nothing more. He would wait in the lobby exactly 15 minutes past his appointment time, long enough to feel the sting of insignificance, but not so long that he might leave. The conference room was set up to maximize the psychological impact my achievements prominently displayed, screens ready to show the full scope of what I had built, and a chair positioned, so he would have to look up at me when I entered. The morning of the meeting, I arrived at the office before dawn, too energized to sleep. I stood at my window watching the city wake up, thinking about the girl who had arrived here with nothing but determination and a burning need to prove herself. That girl had transformed into someone who could reshape entire industries, who held the fate of her tormentors in her manicured hands. The irony that my father had created his own destroyer through his cruelty wasn't lost on me. He had forged me in fire, and now would face the resulting inferno. Madison made one last desperate attempt that morning, showing up at Apex Capital's lobby demanding to see the CEO. Security turned her away per my instructions, but not before she created a scene that multiple witnesses recorded on their phones. Her designer clothes couldn't hide the desperation in her eyes or the tremor in her hands. She screamed about family obligations and threatened lawsuits before being escorted out. I watched the security footage with clinical detachment, seeing not my sister, but the golden child who had laughed while I suffered. As 2 o'clock approached, I took my position in the conference room, seated with my back to the door so I could turn dramatically at the right moment. The presentation screens showed a neutral Apex Capital logo hiding the devastating information loaded beneath. My heart rate remained steady, my hands calm as I held the remote that would control the reveal. Years of waiting had led to this moment, and I intended to savor every second of my father's realization that the daughter he discarded had become more powerful than he ever dreamed possible. At exactly 2:15, my assistant's voice came through the intercom announcing that Mr. Franklin had arrived for his appointment. I remained seated with my back to the door, listening to the sound of footsteps on marble, the whisper of the conference room door opening, the slight catch in breathing as he took in the opulent surroundings. I heard him clear his throat, the same sound that had once preceded so many dismissive lectures about knowing my place. He spoke my assistant's name uncertainly, asking if the CEO would be joining soon, his voice carrying a forced confidence that couldn't quite mask the desperation underneath. I let him stand there for a full 30 seconds, let him absorb the magnitude of the office, the floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing Manhattan's skyline, the awards and accolades that lined the walls. Then, with deliberate slowness, I turned my chair around and watched the color drain from his face as recognition dawned. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his eyes darting between my face and the nameplate reading CEO that sat prominently on the conference table. The portfolio he carried slipped from nerveless fingers, papers scattering across the pristine floor. "Hello, Dad," I said, my voice carrying all the calm authority of someone who had waited years for this moment. "Still think women can't do business?" The transformation in his expression was fascinating to observe, cycling through shock, disbelief, rage, and finally a desperate attempt at composure. He tried to speak several times before managing to croak out my name, as if saying it might somehow change the reality of who sat before him. His legs seemed unsteady as he bent to gather his scattered papers, hands shaking so badly that he dropped them twice more before giving up. The man who had towered over my childhood looked small and fragile in this space I had created. "This is impossible." He finally managed his voice barely above a whisper. You were nothing. You were— I was what exactly? I interrupted, smoothly rising from my chair with practiced grace. The daughter you told would never amount to anything, the one whose college fund you gave to Madison, because boys are better at business. The child whose $8,000 in savings you stole to buy your chosen heir a car. Yes, I was all of those things. And now I'm the CEO of the firm that holds your company's fate in my hands. He attempted to leave, then turning toward the door with something like panic in his movements. I let him reach for the handle before speaking again. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Your loan is due tomorrow at 9 a.m. Without my help, Franklin Construction will cease to exist by noon. Every asset will be liquidated, every employee terminated, every legacy you built over 30 years erased. But please feel free to leave if your pride is worth more than your life's work. The war between his ego and survival played out across his features as he stood frozen at the door. Finally, practically the need to save his company won. He turned back slowly, looking like he had aged a decade in the past 5 minutes. When he spoke, his voice carried a brittle attempt at authority that fooled neither of us. "What do you want?" I smiled then, not kindly, and activated the presentation screens surrounding the conference room. His face appeared in a dozen angles from that day at the coffee shop, frozen in the act of humiliating his own daughter. His voice filled the room from the recorded footage, declaring me a failure, a disappointment, someone who should have known better than to reach above my station. I let it play while watching him relive that moment, seeing it now through the lens of catastrophic miscalculation. "What I want," I said as the footage ended, "is for you to understand the full scope of your blindness. Do you know what you're looking at?" I gestured to the screens now showing corporate structure diagrams. "This is every construction company I own through various holdings. This is every debt I've purchased, including yours. This is every contract you've lost because my subsidiaries offered better terms. You've been slowly drowning for 2 years, and I've been the ocean." His legs finally gave out, and he collapsed into one of the conference chairs like a marionette with cut strings. The fight drained from him as the reality sank in that this wasn't coincidence or bad luck. His destruction had been orchestrated by the daughter he had thrown away. When he looked up at me, I saw something I had never seen in his eyes before, fear mixed with a dawning respect that came far too late to matter. "Madison," he said, suddenly grasping for any leverage. "She needs help. She's your sister." I laughed at that, a sound sharp enough to cut glass. "Madison is a thief who has embezzled over $3 million from your company. Would you like to see the evidence?" The screens changed to show forensic accounting reports, bank transactions, offshore accounts. "I have enough here to send her and her lover to federal prison for a decade. The only reason I haven't is because watching her destroy what you built has been far more satisfying than any courtroom drama could be." He absorbed this blow like all the others, shrinking further into himself. The man who had once stood as an immovable monument to patriarchal authority now looked like a confused child faced with consequences he never imagined possible. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of strength. "What do you want me to do?" "First, I want you to acknowledge some truths," I said, taking my seat across from him. "Tell me about the daughter you threw away. Tell me what you see now that you were too blind to see then." His attempt at manipulation was pathetically transparent. "I always knew you were special." He began trying to rewrite history with words that would have meant everything 20 years ago and meant nothing now. "I was hard on you because I wanted you to be strong." Stop," I commanded, and he did, instantly obedient in a way that would have been unthinkable in my childhood. "You were hard on me because you believed women were inherently inferior. You gave every opportunity to Madison because she was prettier and more pliable. You stole from me, humiliated me, and discarded me because you couldn't see past your own prejudice. The only thing you taught me was that I couldn't rely on anyone but myself. So thank you for that lesson, I suppose." I pulled out a tablet and showed him the real numbers behind his company's collapse. Every mistake, every poor decision, every moment when Madison's incompetence had cost them dearly. He watched in silence as I laid out exactly how his chosen successor had accelerated what his own stubbornness had begun. By the time I finished, tears were rolling down his weathered cheeks, each one a testament to dreams built and destroyed by hubris. Now, I continued, my voice businesslike, let's discuss your options. Option 1, I call in your loans tomorrow morning. Franklin Construction goes into bankruptcy. You lose everything, including the house Mom lives in. Madison gets prosecuted for embezzlement. You spend your remaining years in disgrace, possibly in legal trouble yourself for covering up her crimes. Your legacy becomes a cautionary tale about nepotism and failure. I paused, letting him absorb the full weight of complete destruction before continuing. Option 2, I buy Franklin Construction for 30% of its peak value. You step down immediately and permanently. Madison is terminated and banned from any role in any company I control. She faces prosecution unless she agrees to pay full restitution. You retire quietly with enough to live modestly, and I rebuild the company you destroyed with your blindness. Your employees keep their jobs, your contracts get completed, and something of your legacy survives, even if your name doesn't. The silence stretched between us like a chasm filled with 20 years of pain and rage and bitter satisfaction. I had imagined this moment so many times, but the reality surpassed every fantasy. The man who had given me life and tried to destroy my spirit sat before me, broken and defeated by the very child he had deemed worthless. There was poetry in it, justice in it, and yet something hollow too, like winning a war against an enemy who never understood they were fighting. He raised his head, finally meeting my eyes with something that might have been acknowledgement of what he had created through his cruelty. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute defeat. Option 2. I'll take option 2. I smiled, but it held no warmth, only the satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly. I thought you might. My lawyers will have the papers ready within the hour. But first, there's something else I need you to hear. I stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city I had conquered despite him. You created me, Dad. Every rejection, every humiliation, every moment you told me I was worthless just made me hungrier to prove you wrong. Your hatred was the fuel for my empire. So in a twisted way, I suppose I should thank you. Without your cruelty, I might have settled for ordinary. Instead, you forged me into someone extraordinary through your failure to love me. Congratulations on that singular achievement. When I turned back, he was staring at his hands folded in his lap, looking every one of his 71 years. The father I had feared and sought approval from for so long had been reduced to a signature on documents that would transfer his life's work to the daughter he had discarded. There was no satisfaction in his complete surrender, only a sense of closing a chapter that had defined too much of my life for too long. The next chapter would be written without him as either obstacle or motivation. The paperwork was executed with the kind of efficiency that only comes from years of careful preparation. My legal team had every document ready, every clause crafted to ensure there would be no loopholes, no escape routes for the man who had once told me women couldn't understand complex business dealings. My father signed each page with trembling hands, his signature growing shakier as the reality of transferring his life's work to his discarded daughter sank in deeper. Madison arrived halfway through, having been summoned by security at my instruction, and her hysteria at learning about the embezzlement charges only accelerated his surrender. I presented the evidence against Madison with clinical precision, watching her cycle through denial, rage, and finally terror, as she understood the scope of what I had compiled. The choice I offered her was simple: accept termination pay, full restitution over 10 years, and avoid prosecution or face federal charges that would result in certain conviction. Her lover had already been arrested based on information I had provided to authorities that morning, ensuring she couldn't coordinate stories or hide evidence. She signed the agreement while calling me names that would have hurt if I still cared about her opinion. Within a month, the transformation of Franklin Construction began. I retained the employees who had shown loyalty and competence, despite the toxic leadership offering them better salaries and actual advancement opportunities. The foremen who had quit, rather than work under Madison, were recruited back with apologies and signing bonuses. The company's outdated practices were modernized, inefficiencies eliminated, and a new culture of merit-based recognition replaced the old nepotism. Within 6 months, the company was profitable again, completing projects on time and under budget in ways that hadn't happened in years. My father, stripped of his company and status, attempted to maintain his pride for exactly 2 weeks before reality crashed down. The modest retirement I had allowed him was sufficient for basic comfort, but nothing like the lifestyle he had grown accustomed to. My mother, showing strength I hadn't known she possessed, filed for divorce within a month of the company's sale. She had tolerated his emotional abuse and controlling behavior for 40 years, but watching him destroy their security for the sake of his pride had been the final straw. I set my mother up in a comfortable townhouse near her sister, ensuring she would want for nothing in her remaining years. The first time she visited my office, she spent 20 minutes crying while looking at my achievements, apologizing repeatedly for not protecting me better. I told her that her secret support, that envelope with $2,000, had been the seed that grew into everything around us. We built a relationship in those months that we had never been allowed to have before, free from my father's poisonous influence. Madison's fall from grace was spectacular and public. Without my father's protection and money, she discovered that her circle of society friends had only tolerated her for access to construction contracts and parties. Her social media presence, once filled with luxury and excess, became a chronicle of decline as she sold off designer goods to make restitution payments. She took a job in retail, the kind of position she had once mocked others for having, and learned what it meant to work for every dollar. The humility forced upon her might have been educational if she had possessed the capacity for genuine self-reflection. A year after acquiring Franklin Construction, I was invited to speak at a university women in business conference. Standing before an audience of young women hungry for success, I saw myself at 18 desperate for someone to believe in my potential. I told them an edited version of my story, focusing on the transformation of rejection into motivation, the power of refusing to accept limitations others place on you. What I didn't tell them was the cost in sleepless nights and relationships sacrificed in the hardness that success sometimes demands. During the question period, a young woman raised her hand and asked how to handle family members who didn't support her ambitions. I saw my younger self in her eyes, that mixture of determination and hurt that comes from seeking approval that will never come. I told her that sometimes the greatest gift our detractors give us is the freedom to prove them wrong, that obligation to those who would limit us is a chain we forge ourselves and can choose to break. The applause that followed felt like validation, not just of my success, but of every difficult choice made along the way. 6 months later, an envelope arrived at my office with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from my father, pages of cramped writing that attempted to explain and apologize for decades of wrong. He wrote about growing up in a different time, about fears and insecurities I had never imagined he possessed, about watching his daughter become everything he had been too small to envision. He asked for forgiveness while acknowledging he deserved none, expressed pride, while admitting he had no right to claim any credit for who I had become. I read the letter 3 times before filing it away without responding. Forgiveness wasn't mine to give, not because I still harbored anger, but because some bridges burned can never be rebuilt. I ensured through quiet channels that his basic needs were met, that medical bills were covered, that he wouldn't suffer in old age despite everything. It wasn't mercy or cruelty that motivated this care, but simple indifference. He had become a footnote in my story rather than a central character, and footnotes deserve neither hatred nor love. The scholarship ceremony took place on a crisp October morning at the university where I now served on the board. The Felicia Foundation would provide full rides to 50 young women each year who showed promise, despite challenging family circumstances. As I presented the first awards, I noticed one recipient's father sitting in the back row, his body language radiating disapproval. After the ceremony, I watched him berate his daughter for accepting charity, for pursuing engineering, instead of teaching for thinking she could compete with men in a male field. I approached them quietly, introduced myself, and asked the young woman about her plans. She reminded me so much of myself at that age, brilliant, determined, but still seeking approval from someone incapable of giving it. While her father huffed and puffed about proper roles and realistic expectations, I handed her my business card and told her about our internship program. Then I looked at her father with the kind of calm authority that comes from absolute self-assurance and informed him that his daughter would reshape entire industries if he could simply stop trying to make her small. The girl contacted me the next week, and I became her mentor through college and into her early career. Watching her flourish despite her father's limitations helped heal something in me I hadn't realized still hurt. She graduated at the top of her class and joined my firm, bringing fresh perspectives and innovations that proved once again how much potential is wasted when we limit people based on prejudice rather than ability. Her father eventually came around when her success became undeniable, but by then she had learned the same lesson I had about external validation. Standing in my office 5 years after that confrontation with my father, I looked out at a city skyline where several buildings bore the mark of my influence. Franklin Construction, renamed and revitalized, had become the premium firm for sustainable development. My investment portfolio had expanded beyond construction into technology, healthcare, and education, always with an eye toward businesses that could be transformed through better leadership. The empire built on rejection had evolved into something greater than revenge, a legacy of lifting others who had been similarly dismissed. The photos on my desk told the real story of success. Not the magazine covers or industry awards, but pictures with scholarship recipients at their graduations, with mentees celebrating their first major deals, with my mother on her 70th birthday, finally free to be herself. There was even one of Madison taken at a family counseling session where she had finally acknowledged the damage our father's favoritism had done to both of us. Recovery for her was slow and incomplete, but attempting it was more than I had expected. My assistant knocked and entered with the day's agenda, reminding me about the acquisition meeting that afternoon. Another struggling company needed saving, another group of employees worried about their futures, another owner too proud to admit they needed help until almost too late. It was a familiar pattern now, one I approached with the wisdom earned through my own journey. Sometimes salvation came through gentle guidance, sometimes through tough love, but always with the understanding that transformation was possible for those willing to do the work. The intercom buzzed with news that my next appointment had arrived early, a young woman whose startup showed promise but needed capital and guidance. As I prepared to meet her, I thought about the cycles we create and break, about how pain can become purpose if we choose transformation over bitterness. My father had been wrong about so many things, but he had been right about one without knowing it. I had never amounted to anything he could have imagined. I had become so much more. The greatest revenge I had learned wasn't destruction, but creation. Not tearing down those who had hurt you, but building something so magnificent that their opinions became irrelevant. Every jobs created, every dream funded, every barrier broken was a testament to the power of refusing to accept the limitations others try to place on us. The girl who had once begged for college money had become the woman who made college possible for thousands. The daughter deemed worthless had become the CEO who determined worth. As I walked to the conference room to meet the next generation of dreamers and builders, I carried with me the knowledge that family isn't defined by blood, but by those who see our potential when we're still discovering it ourselves. That success isn't measured in dollars or revenge, but in lives transformed and opportunities created. That the greatest gift my father ever gave me was his rejection, because it forced me to build my worth on foundations that no one else could ever shake. The young woman waiting in the conference room had that hungry look. I recognized that mixture of brilliance and desperation that comes from having more potential than opportunities. As I shook her hand and invited her to share her vision, I knew that another cycle was beginning. Somewhere, perhaps, another father was making another daughter feel worthless, creating another force of nature through his blindness. And somewhere else, that daughter would rise, build, and eventually extend her hand to lift others. This was how the world changed, one rejected daughter at a time, transforming pain into power and power into purpose. My story had begun with a father who couldn't see his daughter's worth, and a daughter desperate to prove she had value. It continued now with a woman who had learned that worth isn't something others can give or take, but something we build within ourselves through every choice to keep going when stopping would be easier. Every scholarship granted, every business saved, every barrier broken was a declaration that we are not defined by those who fail to see us, but by what we choose to become, despite their blindness. The empire built on rejection had become a foundation for others to stand on, reaching heights that would have been impossible alone. And in that transformation lay the ultimate truth. The greatest success isn't in proving our detractors wrong, but in becoming so focused on building something meaningful that we forget they ever doubted us at all. My father had created his own destroyer, but more importantly, he had created someone who could create, who could build, who could transform destruction into opportunity for countless others. That was a legacy worth having, a victory worth winning, and a life worth living. Looking back one final time before heading into that meeting, I whispered a thank you to the ghost of that 18-year-old girl whose dreams had been stolen, but whose spirit had refused to break. She had become everything they said she couldn't, and more than she had dared imagine. The greatest revenge truly wasn't destruction, but the beautiful defiance of a life lived extraordinarily well, despite those who tried to make it ordinary. And with that thought, I opened the door to help another dreamer defy the odds, continuing the cycle of transformation that had begun with 8,000 stolen dollars, and a determination to prove that worth isn't determined by others, but forged in the fires of our own making. What part of this story resonated most with you? Have you ever had to overcome family doubts to achieve your dreams? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. If this story inspired you or reminded you of your own journey, please share it with someone who might need to hear that their current rejection could be redirecting them towards something incredible. Don't forget to like this video if it touched your heart, and subscribe for more stories of triumph over adversity. Remember, sometimes the family that believes in us isn't the one we're born into, but the one we build through our journey. Thank you for joining me today, and may you find the strength to transform every obstacle into an opportunity. Until next time, keep building your empire one dream at a time.